Bonjour and welcome back to the history of the United States since 1877. Last time we talked about World War II and specifically how it began in Japan and Germany and how the United States eventually got dragged into the conflict. Nowadays it would be easy to assume that the United States would win World War II easily because the US Army has turned into such a juggernaut nowadays. The situation as of 1941, however, was quite different. The US Army was far, far smaller than it is today. In fact, it was smaller than the army of Romania at the time. Why was it so? Well, it went back to the tradition at the very beginning of the US Republic, where there was a willingness to expand the army of the United States in wartime, and this is what George Washington had done during the American War of Independence. However, it was thought that you could not have a proper democracy if you spent too much on the military, and so as soon as the War of Independence had ended, George Washington famously had resigned his command, and most of the American Continental Army had been disbanded. And this precedent set by George Washington had been followed throughout the republics, so that whenever you had a big conflict like the War of 1812 or the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, the US Army would rapidly increase, hopefully win the conflict, and then the minute the war was over, you would disband the troops and go to a peacetime military that was as small as it could be. That would save some money, and again, there was a fear that if you had too many soldiers lurking around, that might be a threat to the survival of American democracy. And it was true as late as World War I, where again, the US Army expanded very fast, and then was demobilized in the 1920s and 30s, where the US Army was pitifully small. So when the US entered the war in 1941, it had very, very few troops. Though, of course, it could tap into a large population, business expertise, a large budget, much engineering know-how, so America had a great potential that was really unleashed by this conflict. And ultimately, the American victory was due not only to the courage of the GIs, but also in large part due to the economic might of the United States. Think for a second of all the many things that the American economy was able to do during World War II. For one thing, the United States fought a two-front war, where there's a major war in the Pacific spread over thousands of miles because the Pacific is so huge, all the way from the edge of Australia to Japan and China and so forth. And at the same time, there's an even greater conflict going on in Europe, again, thousands of miles away from the shores of the United States. Usually countries have a very hard time splitting the war effort into two halves like that. Germany suffered when it tried to do that in World War II. Well, the US economy was able to do both and equip two armies on two different battlefields. Not only was the US economy able to do that, but it was also able to equip the allies of the United States through the Lend-Lease program. We covered Lend-Lease last time, and it's that program whereby the United States would lend weapons or lease them to allies with a promise that would be sent back or repaid at the end of the war, or not. And so Britain was a major recipient of Lend-Lease help, but also Russia and pretty much all the allies, including, say, France, that fought on the side of the United States. Beyond that, the United States was able to develop the super-duper secret project called the Manhattan Project. And I hope you have a right security clearance because I will spill all the beans about it. This has nothing to do with real estate in New York City. This is a secret project to develop the atomic bomb. And Germany had quite a few scientists. In fact, some of the best scientists on nuclear fission were located in Germany before the war, people like, say, Lisa Meitner. But Germany could never quite develop a nuclear bomb of its own during World War II, though it tried because the expense was so tremendous. By contrast, the United States had enough resources left over after spending money on its conventional weapons to develop also a nuclear bomb. $2 billion was the cost of that project, back when $1 billion was some very serious money. Beyond that, most countries that fought in World War II were forced to impose some severe rationing on their population. Rationing means that civilians cannot buy all the goods that they want. Even if they have the money for it, there is a quota of things that you can buy every week. You can only have meat on that day, and you can only buy a suit a year, and that kind of thing. And that rationing was quite severe, whether it's on the side of Germany or, say, Britain. Well, the only country that had pretty much no rationing in World War II was the United States, that was not only able to have enough production power for its own army or even the armies of its allies, but enough left over to keep its civilian population pretty well fed and dressed. And sure enough, if you speak to your grandparents or your great-grandparents who lived through World War II, they'll tell you that they had rationing back in World War II. For example, you could not drive too fast, no more than something like 40 or 50 miles an hour, because that would waste some gas. Or it was kind of difficult to find nylons if you wanted to have stockings as a lady, because these were used to make parachutes. And if you wanted to find a spare set of tires for your car, sometimes you had to wait a couple of weeks for that. And there were meatless Tuesdays where you could not have meat on every single day of the week. But when you compare that to the kind of severe hunger that, say, the Jewish people would suffer in Warsaw, in the ghetto, that is kind of a joke. The American population was pretty well fed and dressed throughout the war. In fact, there was so much untapped production potential in the United States that World War II is what ended the Great Depression. In the previous section, we had talked about the New Deal, and I had described it as kind of a half cup, half full, half empty kind of situation, because the situation improved in the US somewhat during the 1930s, but it's really not until the 1940s that all of a sudden you have a mass employment and the GDP skyrockets. And so that was a moment that was quite prosperous for the United States as a result of World War II. As if this were not enough, after World War II there was severe shortage throughout Europe and a fear that the population of, say, Britain or Germany or France might starve or at least be unhappy enough to turn to the communists. So the US put together a large aid program called the Marshall Plan, which was quite massive. You're talking about $13 billion, and that was to reconstruct Europe. So not only was the US able to spend enough money to destroy all Europe, but also to rebuild it after World War II. Again, the only country that could afford to spend that much money. How was that made possible? Well, let me give you just two examples. First, there is the tapping of the American workforce, at least the half of the workforce that was not used much. Traditionally, in the United States, many women, at least those who could afford it, so white women of a certain social standing, tried to stay out of the workforce. Well, that changed completely during World War II, because with so many men being drafted and sent to war and injured or dead, and so many needs to produce civilian goods and military goods at the same time, there was actually a labor shortage, which seems unthinkable just a few years after the Great Depression, where a quarter of the nation had been unemployed. So there was a big campaign to promote female employment, including in professions like riveting and welding and industrial jobs that would have been more male-dominated traditionally. And that's the famous Rosie the Riveter campaign, and I'm sure you have seen those programs or those posters. Also, part of the success of the United States economy during World War II would be the business expertise. And I'll give you the example of the ships, for example. To build a ship normally takes a long time. You need to have a dry dock, and you build a ship based on original plans that are unique to that ship, and you have engineers and welders and such to work for several years before the ship is done, which can be a problem in wartime when you need dozens or hundreds or even thousands of ships in a limited amount of time, and those ships then go on the ocean, and then the German submarines will come in and sink hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping per month. So the solution for the United States was to use the methods of the division of labor and assembly line and so forth that had been developed back by Adam Smith and Taylor and Ford in earlier years. And these became known as the Liberty ships, and they're not warships, they're not battleships, they would be more cargo ships, but they're still essential because that's how you're going to transport goods all the way to Asia or Europe, and they need to be produced in huge quantities because they have a way of getting sunk by Japanese and German submarines. The way to produce them fast would be to have them pre-assembled in large chunks, and they're all built to the same model, so you gain time by having mass production. And when you get to shore, then you just assemble them, those huge pre-made chunks together, you weld them, and as a result, you can make a ship not in a matter of years, but months or weeks. Even as a publicity stunt, one of the ships was built in just a matter of days, just to make a point. And so there were so many of them around that no matter how many were sunk by the Germans, you still had quite enough to develop the goods and bring them all the way to foreign shores. And you see that also in the matter of more battleships and aircraft carriers and so forth. When the Japanese Navy lost a number of aircraft carriers in the Battle of Midway, for example, it could never quite recoup its losses because its shipbuilding rate was so slow. The US Navy, by contrast, was able to build as many as 2 aircraft carriers per month by the end of the war, and battleships and landing craft and everything. In fact, had so much production potential that it was able to develop some ice cream ships in the Pacific, where they would go around from island to island to deliver fresh ice cream to the troops as a way to boost morale. Clearly the kind of thing that you do if you have some spare capacity and you've already covered all the bases and you can do some luxuries like ice cream. During my research, I've tried to figure out whether they went around their neighborhood playing the little music like the ice cream trucks do. I haven't been able to figure that much. So if you're interested in learning more about World War II, there are thousands upon thousands of books. Here are two that I recommend among many others. One by John Keegan is really more into the military aspects if you're more of a war buff and you want to know which battle and that battle happened on the Western Front or the Eastern Front. The other one, A Democracy at War by William McNeill, is more about what it meant for a nation to fight a war when it was a democracy as opposed to a dictatorship like Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia. And it is indeed complicated to fight a war when you are a democracy because you need to explain to your people why you are fighting in the first place. Of course, Stalin and Hitler tried to convince the troops that they were fighting the good cause, but ultimately whether you agree with it or not doesn't really matter because either they fight or they will be shot. In the American context, however, you'd better have a strong reason why your citizens are going to fight because they really hate being sent overseas and potentially losing limb or life, and these people vote, so they need to have a strong rationale. Back in World War I, Woodrow Wilson had said that the United States was fighting for the 14 points. Well, Franklin D. Roosevelt had a somewhat shorter list, and he called that the 4 freedom speech. We're down from 14 to 4. These 4 freedoms that the GIs were fighting for in World War II would be freedom from fear, freedom from want, meaning from hunger and such, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. So saying that would be inspired in part by the American Constitution, freedom of speech and religion that are found in the First Amendment, but also from the experience of the Great Depression. Freedom from want is really something that is derived from that era. You have a great illustration of those 4 freedoms done by Norman Rockwell. Another key document would be the Atlantic Charter, which is called the Atlantic Charter because it was negotiated by Roosevelt and Churchill in Canada, so on a ship just off in the Atlantic, and a charter is just an agreement, a document. And in it, if you compare it side by side with, say, the 14 points, you'll see a lot of overlap between what Wilson and the US had been fighting for in World War I and what Roosevelt and America would be fighting in World War II. Things like freedom of the seas, the concept of self-determination, and so forth. And it's not a surprise that there is some overlap between the two because, after all, Roosevelt had been a Democrat and had served under the administration of Wilson in World War I, so there's a continuity in American ideals from one conflict to the other. This being said, being a democracy at war is not easy because wars tend to have a way of eroding civil liberties, and we saw that in World War I as well, where during the conflict there was much abuse against German Americans, as well as the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Act, which had limited the ability of Americans to criticize the war. Eugene V. Debs, the socialist leader, for example, had been sent to prison just because he opposed World War I. And that's really true of every conflict. There's a tendency to rally around the flag and punish everybody who is not 100% against the war. And even as the United States was fighting a war that was supposed to be about the 4 freedoms and self-determination, there were some limitations to it back at home. For example, segregation between blacks and whites is still the norm in the United States, especially in the South. And Roosevelt, who was a Democrat, and the Democratic Party was quite strong among whites in the South, never dared to go against it. So you have segregation in the US Army still, and this would not end until 1948 after World War II. And as a general rule, black units are employed in more menial tasks and support role and logistics.
And this could go quite far in a way that was rather silly. For example, early in the war, the Red Cross would not accept blood from black donors because, well, segregation. And when enough black donors complained, the Red Cross began accepting black blood, but in a way that was segregated, where you have pouches of black blood and of white blood, which makes no sense from a biological perspective. We are all human beings with the same biological properties, but that was a way to assuage the concerns of segregationists. And that continued throughout World War II. In fact, in some southern states, the blood banks remained segregated until the 1960s or 70s, and that would include Louisiana.
Beyond that, you also have a wave of discrimination against Japanese Americans, either Issei or Nisei, and the distinction between them being either people that are born in the US and that would be citizens from birth, and others that have immigrated during their lifetime and may have become US citizens, but were not natural-born citizens. As it happens, the distinction doesn't matter much because during World War II, all of them are sent to internment camps and kind of rounded up all across the West Coast. The rationale for it is that they might be more loyal to Japan than to the United States and might carry out acts of sabotage or espionage. So it's really based on the color of their skin. Many of them are born in the US, are loyal Americans, but just because they look Asian, they're sent to a prison for several years, which is a major violation of your human rights. These are called internment camps. So there are some limitations to the way America fights a war in terms of democracy. Obviously, it's miles ahead of whatever is going on in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia at the time. Another way in which you can fight as a democracy is trying to limit how much fighting is going on the ground, because the minute you put boots on the ground, then the casualty rates are higher. So there was a great desire on the part of the United States to win the war from the air as much as possible. And there were some strategists in the US that really thought that you could win the war through air power alone. There are different ways in which you can fight. One of them would be tactical bombing, which is bombing in close support. And the Germans did quite a bit of that. That means that if you're in actual combat, then there's an enemy machine gun position, then you radio in for some low-flying airplane to come in and drop one single bomb on that machine gun nest, and that's tactical support. The strategic bombing is something much more ambitious, where you have high-flying airplanes with a long range that will go all the way to the heart of the enemy country and then drop bombs on some key assets of their economy. Maybe their oil refineries or a factory making ball bearings. And the hope was that by that point, American technology was such that you could drop bombs with great precision and destroy specifically that particular target. For that, though, you would have to be straight and level, not too high, and flying in broad daylight, because that's the only way you could hit a target. And even then, as it turned out, American technology as of World War II was not that precise. Anyway, if you're flying straight and level in broad daylight, well, the Germans are going to shoot you down, and the casualty rates were enormous. So the United States shifted after that to a strategy of high-level bombing at night in order to protect its crews, but that meant in that case the precision would be minimal, and so the only thing you can do is area bombing, meaning in that case you can only target the entire city, not the factory, and so you just destroy the whole city to get to that one factory. The rationale behind it would be that it might terrorize the population altogether. Even if you don't hit the factory, the fact that you will be dehousing the workers and destroying an entire city might lessen the will to fight of the German population. So by that point, you're getting into some difficult philosophical issues. The Geneva Convention are a series of treaties that the US signed and other countries, usually late 19th, early 20th century, that would be kind of the rules of war and how you're able to do legally something as horrible as war. And one of the key rules in there is that you have to do your utmost not to kill civilians. And so that's where if you start bombing entire cities, knowing full well that you will be killing mostly civilians, in fact, that's kind of the goal of the operation, because you're doing terror bombing, then you can see how you would have crossed the line into what is clearly a violation of the rules of war. That is true when bombing places in Germany, like say Dresden, but it's even more so the case in Japan, where by 1944-45, the United States got close enough that it was able to unleash hell on Japan. The person that was in charge of that bombing would be a US Air Force general called Curtis LeMay, whose goal, and he said so himself, was to bomb Japan back into the Stone Age, and came pretty close to it, either through conventional bombing or fire bombing, which worked really well in Japan since most of the houses were made of paper and wood, or famously at the very end of the war, nuclear bombs. And the result was a tragedy. Using just fire bombing alone, something like 100,000 or 200,000 Japanese civilians were burned to death in one night alone during a raid on Tokyo. And pretty much every city in Japan that was over 50,000, 100,000 people was reduced to ashes before even the nuclear bombs were used. If you're interested in that issue of the bombing of Japan and the philosophical underpinnings and whether that would be a war crime, I highly recommend watching the movie The Fog of War, which is about Robert McNamara, who served in World War II, and he's quite honest about looking back on those issues, thinking, well, I may have been a war criminal back then. If you want to wash your mouth after that and feel better about being an American, watch that other movie on the air war called Memphis Belle, which is a more inspiring story of good American air crews going to Germany and maybe making it back alive. As it turned out, strategic bombing was enough to severely limit the ability of the Germans and the Japanese to develop their economy, but never enough to bring their operations to a halt and never enough to terrorize the population into suing for peace, at least until the very end of the war for Japan. So you had to put boots on the ground after all. And this was kind of a slow process, and I like to compare World War II to a tide at sea, the ebb and flow of the tide. So whereas in 1940-41, the Japanese and the Germans seemed unstoppable and the tide was rising, by 1942-43 is when the tide would turn with some very important American victories and British and Russian. In Asia, after the major setback suffered initially in Hawaii and the Philippines, there was an important naval battle at Midway, which is not too far from Hawaii. The Japanese were never able to make up those losses, and so that's the beginning of American dominance of the seas. Meanwhile, there was a major ground war fought in the small island of Guadalcanal, which would be in the Solomon Islands, and this is mostly a US Marines operation with some Army support and Navy support. And you'll be happy to know that this was another American victory, and that's the first time the Japanese were stopped, and that prevented them from taking over Australia, for example, and from the point forward, they were on the defensive and started to lose islands instead of getting them. A similar process unfolded in Europe, where after the initial Nazi onslaught by 1942-43, they suffered some major setback. A famous one would be in the city of Stalingrad in Russia, which was named after the dictator, Stalin. And after a very long and brutal siege, the Russians were able to save that city, in fact, encircle an entire German army and force it to surrender. So from that point forward, the Germans stopped their invasion of Russia and started being on the defensive, and for the next couple of years started moving back towards the German borders. The Germans had also invaded North Africa and again seemed unstoppable for a while until the British inflicted a major defeat against the Germans at El Alamein, which, if I'm not mistaken, would be in Libya today. And then around the same time, the Americans started to land some troops in North Africa in places like Morocco, later Tunisia, and then hopped into Sicily, and eventually the Italian mainland, and so that's another sign that US will be pushing into Europe. The invasion of Italy by the United States, however, was a long grind because Italy is a narrow peninsula with quite a few mountains in the middle, and so it took forever to just go up the Italian peninsula, and even if you were successful in the end, you bump into the Alps. So getting to Germany would be a very long, slow process that might never win the war, at least not in a lifetime. What you really needed was the landing in northwestern Europe, much closer to the German heartland, in an area that is kind of flat and where you have easy operations in terms of getting straight into the heart of Germany. That became known as opening a second front, since the first front would be the Eastern Front between Germany and Russia. Well, the Americans were not the only ones thinking of it. Obviously, the Germans had looked at the same map and knew the same thing, and so in preparation for American assault, the Germans had built up something called the Wall of the Atlantic. It's not quite a continuous wall like the Wall of China. It would be more like a series of fortifications, bunkers, pillboxes, obstacles on the beaches and such, going all the way from the border with Spain, which was neutral, all the way to the tip of Norway in the north. But the major fortifications would be northern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, the areas directly facing Britain. So if you are on the American and British side and you want to know where to land, the more obvious place by looking at the map would be in the Dieppe-Calais area of northern France, because that's the part where the English Channel is narrowest, so your troops will have to sail very short distances from Britain, and any kind of air support from British airfields would be easy. On the other hand, that also happens to be the place where the Germans are expecting you. And so this is where the Wall of the Atlantic was the strongest. To test the defenses there and know whether it would be possible to do a landing, the British Americans thought, well, we should land there and just do a little try. It will be more of a suicide operation because, well, we're pretty sure it will never work. So why don't we ask the Canadians to do it? And so you have a major raid at Dieppe in 1943, which turned out to be exactly what people had expected, a major slaughter. And so that proved to the person in charge of the landing in Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower, later became US president, that this might be the shortest spot to the British Isles, but not the best spot. So maybe it might be better to land further away. It might be more complicated, but at least the defenses of the Wall of the Atlantic might be a bit more easy to penetrate. And so that's why he selected Normandy as a site for the famous D-Day operation, not because it was an easy spot to land on, in fact it's kind of far away, but because it would be an unexpected spot. To add even further surprise, he decided to land far away from major ports, because normally you always want to land at a port or next to a port, because in the days following the invasion you have hundreds of thousands of tons of material that will come in. Well, instead of landing in Cherbourg, which is a major port from Normandy, or Le Havre, which is another major port, he landed smack in the middle, about 100 miles from either one, in a spot where you have no major port, thus benefiting from the element of surprise. What kind of port would you use then? Well, you bring it along with you. And in Britain, they started building huge boxes of concrete that they nicknamed mulberries. That's a code name for it. The Germans could never quite figure out what they were for, and in fact it's just a prefabricated port. You float those huge boxes of concrete because they're empty, they float, bring them all the way to the coast of Normandy after the landing, open the valves, sink them in place, and you create huge jetties, piers that will stick out into the ocean in two different spots. You build two ports, and this way, instead of spending years building a port, you can do that in a matter of days and bring your port with you. That's the purpose of those mulberries. Landing in Normandy, however, would yield no benefit if the Germans knew of it, because you had picked a complicated spot far away from Britain, far away from any port. The only way that this could yield some rewards would be if the Germans were unaware of it. So in parallel with Operation Overlord, which is the overall code name for the invasion of Normandy, you had something called Operation Fortitude, which is the code name for deception, to convince the Germans that the landing would take place in Calais and Dieppe and not in Normandy. The actual landing took place in kind of three phases. The night before the June 6, 1944 landing, the French resistance was informed that the landing would take place, and the resistance would be like a French underground, civilians that were collaborating with the British and Americans while living under Nazi-occupied France. So what were they expected to do? Well, maybe blow up some bridges, cut off telegraph lines, so that the troops that were on the front line in Normandy could not be able to contact back their reinforcements to tell them to send tanks and so forth. So that's the element played by the French resistance. Also, the night before June 6, a number of paratroopers were launched either on the western side of the landing area, and that's where American troops would land, the 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne. They suffered immense casualty rates because they dropped into the unknown at night with very bad location devices. So some of them landed in swamps and drowned right there. Others were swept over a wide area and were kind of lost in the middle of the night, but eventually did manage to achieve their mission, which was to capture the small town of Sainte-Mère-Église, where all the roads would kind of connect, and this way protect the western access to the landing site. Meanwhile, the British paratroopers would do the same operation all the way in the east along the Orne River, which they managed to do with much lesser casualties. The third phase would be in the morning of June 6, and that's the famous one that you've seen in all these news reels and all documentaries, and that would involve the landing of GIs and British and Canadian and French troops at the 5 beaches nicknamed Utah and Omaha on the American side, Gold, Juno, and Sword on the British, Canadian, French side. These went better than expected, except at Omaha, where the casualty rates were extremely high. In fact, once you go to Normandy to travel those battle sites, I recommend going to the cemetery at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, where a lot of the casualties sustained by Americans during the fighting of the Battle of Normandy, that's where they're interred, about 10,000 of them. A beautiful, beautiful and moving location. The landing took place on June 6, and at the end of that day, even though the landing was successful, the Allies would only control maybe a 1 mile of territory going inland, and their progress over the next months was pretty slow. If you look at the map, you'll see that the big city of Normandy, the city of Caen, C-A-N, is located about 10 miles inland and was not taken for a whole month. The reason being that going inland from the beaches was difficult due to the local terrain. What the locals call the bocage, which would be in very, very small fields surrounded by hedgerows. And so for troops to go through those hedgerows would be difficult, and then there might be a machine gun position on the other side manned by Germans. It might take a whole day to win that, and then when you go forward by a quarter mile or even less, and you're on the next field, and you start the process all over again. It's not until the very end of June, early July, that one American tank general, Patton, was able to break through in the southwestern corner of the front line into the more open terrain of the fields and the plains of western France. And then after that, the process was much faster. By August of 1945, which would be just a month later, the Allies, French and American divisions were in Paris, which they liberated. By December, they were in Alsace, which would be on the border of Germany. There was one last big counteroffensive by the Germans called the Battle of the Bulge. The Bulge, in that case, is not referring to the ongoing American war with obesity. A bulge would be kind of a salient spot where the front line has a little nudge, and that's where the Germans attacked in the winter of 44 to 45. Though American generals were able to hold their position and then resume their offensive in the spring of 45, that time straight into the heart of Germany. Meanwhile, the Russians were inflicting even greater casualties on the Eastern Front and slowly grinding their way through Poland into Eastern Germany, eventually captured the capital, Berlin, in the spring of 45, which is where Hitler did the best thing he ever did, which was to shoot himself in his bunker, and shortly thereafter his subordinates sued for peace. May 8, 1945 is when the war ended in Europe, VE Day.
And now is the time when you should pause the video and look at that famous picture, which is representing a Russian army soldier raising the Russian flag over the Reichstag, the German parliament in Berlin, and see if you can spot something that is a bit odd, and it's pretty difficult to find. Can you see it? Well, let's zoom in on a soldier at the bottom right of the photo, and you might notice that he's having two watches. One on his left hand, where most people would hold their watch, and another one on the right hand. And in the official picture that was released by Stalin, the right hand was cleaned up so that there is no clock there. What's the reason? Well, normally people don't have two watches, so if this man was holding two watches, it meant that while capturing Germany, the Russians had been looting and stealing watches from the locals, which they had. That's the reason why that soldier had two watches. But that did not look too good for propaganda purposes. And so Stalin, who had a habit of cleaning the historical record just to make it look better for himself, made sure that the photo was cleaned up before it was released. And that's the general point I want to make about history. Even when you look at pictures, always be very, very careful. A picture is worth 1,000 words, but just like words, it can tell 1,000 lies. Always keep your critical thinking skills with you.
Japan still continued fighting for a few more months, so it was pretty clear they would lose now that not only Americans, but British and Russian forces would be against them, and then 2 nuclear bombs in August of 45, and that's when finally the Emperor of Japan came out of seclusion and told his men on the radio, just stop that war, we have lost, and that became VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. A quick note about that famous photograph that you've all seen of an American serviceman celebrating in the middle of New York City, and that beautiful kiss, which has been reproduced in countless photos. As it turned out, many, many years later, they were able to find out who that woman was. It was long a mystery. And she was not the girlfriend of that sailor. In fact, she was just a passersby who had been grabbed forcibly by the sailor and kind of forced to kiss, and that's what was captured on camera. So that gives kind of a different layer to that photograph. In a way, it's everybody being happy because the war is over at long last, or what you might be witnessing there is more of a sexual assault. Another famous photograph with an interesting backstory would be this one, where you see American servicemen raising the flag on Iwo Jima during one of the last battles of the war in the Pacific. As it happens, this photo is also problematic since it was restaged after the fact. It was not caught in the action. If you're interested in that particular moment, there are 2 movies on the topic, shot one from the Japanese side and the other from the American side. That would be Letters from Iwo Jima and then Flags of Our Founders. While we're on the topic of movies, I want to recommend 2 great movies on D-Day. One which is an older one called The Longest Day, and then the more famous, more recent epic, Saving Private Ryan by Steven Spielberg. We still have to talk about the peace settlements that came after 1945, and we'll study that in the next lecture. But before I sign off for today, I want to revisit an issue that was an underlying theme today, and that is how war undermines democracy. We saw that when we studied World War I with the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which prevented some Americans, such as Eugene V. Debs, to speak their mind, otherwise they would be sent to prison. And we saw that again today, where one community, the Japanese Americans, would be sent to internment camps, not because of anything they had committed, but only because of who they were. We'll see that again when we study the Cold War, because for a period in the 1950s, the McCarthy era, there's a big wave of anti-communist hysteria where many people, whether in schools or in Hollywood, are targeted not because of the crime they have committed, but because they held a left-of-center views. And if you're old enough to remember 9/11, after these terrorist attacks in 2001, the US Congress passed an act called the Patriot Act, which, in the name of the war on terror, severely curtailed American liberties. For example, the government would start spying on Americans' cell phone conversation on a huge scale. So liberty can be one of the biggest casualties of war. And in a way, that brings us back all the way to the founding days of the Republic, where people like George Washington were concerned that a large standing army, or an army in general, might be a threat to democracy. So I will let you ponder all of these issues and stop it there. Au revoir, see you next time.